Yeah, we go.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, hello and thank you. I currently work as a freelance find specialist, and recently worked in commercial archaeology doing post-excavation management and small finds work. Um, and I completed my PhD in archaeology in 2014. So I'm going to first kind of give a little recap about that and some of the kind of, I guess, some of the results from that research. And then, because that kind of leads on to what I'm going to be talking about today, which is what I call big beads from the Iron Age. Um, okay, so my PhD thesis looked at glass beads from Iron Age Britain, and I was really trying to do a couple of different things with this. So on the one hand, yeah, a lot of it ended up being about typology, and I was reassessing the scheme that was published in 1978 by Margaret Guido, also known as Peggy Piggott. And I also built on that typology in light of some recent discoveries, because it turned out that there were some unusual types and things that hadn't been previously discovered at the time she did her work. But I didn't want to understand glass beads just in terms of types and descriptions and date. And the dating of a lot of these beads turned out to be quite complicated to untangle, and still something I need to kind of go back to look at. But I wanted to understand how they were used in the past. And that's not something that Guido really discussed in detail in her work. And so the best evidence that we have, of course, is from inhumations, as the settlement finds tend to be single beads, whereas in inhumations, we sometimes get multiple beads, and it kind of gives us a bit more idea of how they were used together. So although burial evidence throughout the Iron Age is quite variable, which I will encounter, by combining settlement and burial evidence, I was able to at least sort of suggest that there were regional differences in the type of beads that people were using, and that these patterns seem to change over time as well. And I attempted to bring in additional evidence for dress by looking at objects like brooches, bracelets, and finger rings from this period to understand how, to try and understand how these, all of these objects kind of came together to form dress. And this really turned out to be a bit of a mammoth task and kind of beyond the scope of the PhD. But this really, it kind of like left me with so many unanswered questions. So in this paper, what I wanted to look at is a particular category of bead, and how I've kind of started to approach understanding how they were used. And so on this slide, I've just got a couple of pictures of some of the more typical beads we have from this period, as well as some of the reconstructions that came up with on the right-hand side. Okay, so here, these are some examples of the types of beads that I call big beads. Really, these are usually like 2 to 4 centimeters in diameter. They're usually annular-ish in shape, or donut shaped. They're made from multiple colors of glass, and a lot of them are decorated. So in contrast, a lot of the other beads we have from Iron Age Britain are around 1 centimeter in diameter or smaller, and they come in a variety of shapes and decoration, and some are just plain undecorated types as well. So because these beads are so big, one of my follow-up questions just kind of comes back to like a very basic question about use. How were they used? Were they used as necklaces or some other form of bodily adornment? Or could they have been used for some other purpose? And when looking at the beads, I still couldn't quite get my head around some of these large ones were actually used in a practical sense. So this is a collection of 8 beads that were found together in a late Iron Age mirror burial from Dorset. And I made this reconstruction for my PhD because I wanted to get an idea of how these would have actually looked when they were worn and used, as if they were a necklace. These would actually be quite heavy if they were worn like this, at 121 grams. And I would expect most of the other necklaces, like the ones from inhumations at like Wetwing Flat, for example, to be under 50 grams in total. So probably not at all practical, but it would certainly be a bit of a statement piece if they were worn like this. So in this burial, there were 5 glass beads and 3 stone beads. 3 of the glass beads have spiral decoration on them, and these are a type that's pretty typical for the late Iron Age. And there's many other examples of these from Britain, but very few from inhumation contexts, which makes this particular burial very important for understanding how they were used. Unfortunately, because it was a metal detector find, we don't actually know how the beads were placed in relation to bodies within the burial. So another burial that had large beads but not glass is the late Iron Age burial from Birdlip in Gloucestershire. So these are well, the beads come from an antiquarian discovery, and I was really lucky enough to take a visit to the Gloucester Museum before the pandemic, like literally just before the pandemic started, because I was trying to follow up on some of the beads that I wasn't able to look at during my PhD. So there's 20 beads in total, but they're mostly amber, except for 2 shale beads and another bead that I'm not quite sure what material is other than it's stone. This is a really unusual find because amber isn't actually used much in the Iron Age, at least not in Britain. And if they were strung together, all these beads wouldn't have been it wouldn't have been long enough to actually create a necklace. So it seems like they may have incorporated organic beads, or perhaps they were strung on a thick cord, maybe with knots to separate the beads from each other, or the ends of the string might have been left exposed. So there's different kind of things to consider when kind of coming up with the reconstruction. The perforations actually vary a lot. You can see on the diagram on the left, some of the larger ones are at the top, and overall they vary from 4.3 millimeters to 22.5 millimeters. So this is actually quite a large difference when you're considering the material that you're stringing them on, if they're all strung onto the same strand of thread or yarn, and kind of has implications for how they would look when they're strung together. So in the reconstruction I've done on the right, you can see the beads in the middle, they have the largest perforation holes, so they kind of would have hung differently than the others with the smaller perforation holes, so they would kind of sink down a little bit more. So this is just a hypothetical reconstruction on what I think it would kind of look like if they were strung on like a 4 millimeter string. It just kind of helps to, I think, like picture what they would look like, but when worn, and kind of how that would look in relation to garments that were being worn at the same time. So I guess coming back to like big beads and what they were being used for, because I feel like because we have so few from inhumations, I felt like I needed to investigate them more as a category, and so as a starting point, I wanted to see how the Portisham mirror burial beads fit with the Birdlip burial beads, and kind of compare them to like the rest of the data that I have for these big beads. So this is a bit of a messy place to start, but and I need to do a little bit of data cleanup here before I decide on anything more conclusive. But my first impressions are that the beads I consider to be in the big bead category form a neat spread, and that's the orange dots there. So that's kind of like my background data. And the porticium and birdlip beads kind of do fit in with the overall size, although we do have, there's some examples that are quite larger in the 40 millimeter plus zone. So that's the diameter. And it seems some of these beads really were spectacularly big when so if they were worn as bodily adornment, they really would have stood out, I think, as being something quite different. But again, they're the amber beads, so they might have stood out as being different anyways, just because of the color of the material. But you know, some of these smaller big beads, they're highly decorated with multiple colors of glass. So bit on the smaller scale, but overall, like I feel like these beads were kind of like big statement type pieces if they were worn like this. Okay, so my next slide. I've also considered some alternative uses, and perhaps these large beads weren't actually worn on the body, and perhaps I feel like this is a bit of an assumption on my part. And my initial thoughts for an alternative purpose was that perhaps they could have been used as spindle whorls. So here I've compared the dimensions of these beads with the spindle whorls from Danebury. And again, this is a bit rough and ready. I'd really like to compare the sizes of beads with the dimensions of late Iron Age spindle whorls, because that would be a bit more of a contemporary comparison. But you would not believe how difficult it is to find dimensions and weights of spindle whorls in publication, in published site reports. So to get comparable data, I think I'll actually have to do some museum trips to record dimensions myself. But this is just kind of a starting point, just to kind of get a feel for, I guess in a way, like feasibility, and to see kind of what an initial comparison would start to look like. And so just kind of my initial impression is that spindle whorls are a bit larger than these beads that I'm calling big beads. But, there's a little bit of overlap, but they almost seem to be forming kind of distinct size categories. And just kind of as a final kind of comparison, I looked at the ratio of the diameter and the height of both beads and spindle whorls to get, and it just kind of helps to give an understanding of the object's shape and size. And I've plotted this against weight. Again, like it's still a bit of a messy data, and ideally would need to get some late Iron Age spindle whorls to compare to. But again, initial impression here is that the objects that I'm calling beads and the ones that we're calling spindle whorls are really quite distinct. I think if I could get to a museum, I would really like to record spindle whorls firsthand, and then I would be able to calculate the moment of inertia for both objects, and then I could test whether these beads could have functioned in a similar way to contemporary whorls, but that's something that's going to have to wait a little while longer until I can get to a museum. So this is a bit of a research in progress, but I'm hoping this kind of shown that I'm looking at these big beads and really trying to consider how they were used, and some alternatives possibilities. And I'd really like to, I think, in the future, bring in more contextual information on how these beads were used, especially on the continent at the same time, or the late Iron Age, as I think this might help to provide an understanding and potential interpretation for how they're used in Britain. So thank you for listening, and do get in touch if you have any questions or comments, or happy to answer any questions here.